opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions or beliefs of Marshall University, Marshall University Libraries, the Department of English, the College of Liberal Arts, Marshall University Film Studies, or HerdCon.
Just keep rolling, just
The
keep
bloopers.
going. We had the whole problem last time where I kept saying, what was it, Stephen, whatever the word.
Quinn Carter.
It was Quinn Carter. Steve King and his novel, The Shinning. All right. Blah. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. This is our latest episode of Book Chats. I am Cody Lumpkin.
And I am Meghan Sexton-Harness.
And so we've got another horror book for you today. So what do we have, Meghan?
I don't think this needs any introduction. I think pretty much everybody knows him, but just in case.
Yeah.
Stephen King.
Also, I guess if you check like the headline or the title of this, you'd probably know what we were talking about. But if you don't know who Stephen King is, if maybe you're like really young or you've just been doing whatever in your life, I'll give a little bio of the author Stephen King. A horror icon, Stephen King is one of the world's best-selling authors. Many of his books have become worldwide bestsellers and have been adapted into movies, miniseries including Carrie, The Shining, The Stand, It, Misery, and many, many others. Many of his works are set in his home state of Maine, where he still resides with his wife, Tabitha, who is an author of over 20 books that include short stories, poetry, and novels. His sons, Joe Horn and Owen King, are also successfully published authors. His child, Naomi, is a minister in the Unitarian Universalist Church. Stephen King is also a major Boston Red Sox fan. If you've read any of his work, that pops up here and there. And he was a member of the charity rock supergroup, the Rock Bottom Remainders, which included Mitch Albom, Amy Tan, and I believe Barbara Kingsolver had a run in that band. So it was a lot of successful authors, and they would play for charity. And they were clearly like, they could play their instruments, but they were an amateur band. So it's kind of like you get to see your favorite authors kind of play like a bar band. So it was and I believe Maya Angelou was an honorary member at some point, and then some like Bruce Springsteen or some well-known musicians would come and play with them sometimes. But it was all done for charity because, hey, they were successful authors and they could do those kind of things. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm sure you could find footage. You could find footage on the internet if they're playing if you're really hankering for some a best-selling author rock band.
Were they good?
I think it was kind of like the selling point was like they weren't that good.
Okay.
It's like they can't be great at everything.
That's what I was thinking.
But they enjoyed it, and you have a good time. Yeah, just come see them. Yeah, they had disbanded in the early 2000s. I think they got back together in like 2015 briefly. So maybe there'll be a new iteration when we have enough successful authors that'll be like, yeah, let's start the charity playing.
If there's any left that haven't been canceled.
Yes, or I'm sure there'll be more. There'll always be popular authors. Hopefully, I have faith. But yes.
So I don't know if we've mentioned that we're talking about The Shining.
Yeah, we're talking about The Shining.
We did Stephen King. So Stephen King for you. You're a little older than me. What was it like for you? Because I think by the time I really became conscious, he was already a household name.
Yeah, I mean, he's like, I remember growing up as a kid. This is back in the days when they would have cartoons on in the afternoon in like the major news stations or like the UHF stations, if anybody remembers what those were. And I would often see commercials for like this thing called the Stephen King Book Club. And you could get like the first book free. So the ones I remember was Carrie and Misery were the two. Like, here's your first book. And then every month, we'll have a Stephen King book, which I've looked online, and I just had downloaded like somebody's checklist of, you can't see it if you're watching the podcast, the checklist of all the novels he has published, and I don't have them all on here because it was too big of a list. But yeah, even back in the 80s, your Stephen King book club membership would run for a while, and you probably still get something he puts out a book or two a year. He's just insanely prolific. There's the whole thing about him, basically as a habit, trying to write about 7 pages a day when he's drafting a novel, which is which is wild. That is like National Novel Writing Month is just a daily practice kind of levels of word count. And he's extremely prolific, and he's really good. He's really good too. So a lot of, a lot of people probably like are envious and resentful, but also like, how does he do it kind of thing.
His old tried and true method of getting a bunch of Coke and locking yourself up.
Yeah.
I mean,
he definitely seems to be, as a writer, very much this kind of creature of habit. Like, as of this recording, David Lynch had recently passed. And there's a thing about like for many, many years, maybe even for most of his life, he would have like a tuna sandwich for lunch and then some chicken and broccoli for dinner. This kind of routine that would, have a certain stability in his life because he's worried about all the other stuff
Sure.
he wanted to do creatively. And I think in some ways, Stephen King's been an author who's talked openly about his struggles with addiction, with alcohol, with cocaine. He was injured in the 90s and a car hit him, and I think he was dealing some with painkillers after that. He was in a lot of pain for that. And so he's someone that how to like keep control of your life and how to avoid it from like spiraling out of control. So he seems like certainly an individual who, identifies as someone with addiction and alcoholism and trying to control that. And I think some of it is through his art. Like, I have to keep working on something. He doesn't need the money anymore, but he's still, he's still putting out books. And he still has things he wants to say, which I think is encouraging for us all and hopeful.
absolutely. And I mean, when you're passionate about something, it's not for the money anymore.
Yeah, I don't think he needs it. But yeah, and he's very active on social media and he's one of those multimillionaires that tries to do good in the world. So I think we don't have that many of those, and I think he's one of the more thoughtful ones out there. So
Absolutely. I've seen several of his takes, and they're always refreshing to hear. But speaking about his struggles, I think that's something that we really see reflected very, very clearly in The Shining through Jack. And before we get into the book, I want to go ahead and talk about the elephants in the room of the movies and the TV documentaries. That was actually technically my introduction to Stephen King. Was the Pet Sematary movie.
yeah,
I don't know if on this podcast I've talked about it before, but my mom had me young and wasn't ready to give up horror movies, so I was right along with her.
you turned out fine.
I have a career now, so
It worked out.
but the one that she could never watch was The Shining. Still to this day, my mom has never watched or read The Shining. She says it's too terrifying. Which is funny because we talked about a little bit. That's my comfort movie. Not a man going crazy and trying to murder his wife and son, but just the isolated, snowed-in hotel with all the food you could eat. That's my dream. Especially add some spooky to it. Perfect.
Yeah, it does have a little bit in a different way. We one of the previous episodes we talked about the pecan children or the pecan children. And there's a kind of cozy aspect to it. This kind of small town. It's got sort of kind of Hallmark Christmas film, vaguely Hallmark Christmas film vibes to it. And yeah, and this has like you and the people you love have this big house, and you can just wait out the winter with all the supplies you'll ever need, and nobody needs to bother you. It sounds really nice, doesn't it? Yes. And perhaps it's not.
And I was reading when I was doing my research for this episode, Stephen King was talking about how you can't have horror without love. And I think that this does a great job of that. It takes what should be this idyllic, beautiful situation and says, but what about horror?
Yeah. I think needing to have horror coming out of not just completely foreign and exotic places, though that's certainly a part of horror. Those domestic spaces, those, it's the stat, you're most likely to be killed by a family member than you are strangers. So these are the people that you live with. Are, if anybody's going to kill, it's going to be the people you live with. I hope that is never the case for anyone who does or does not listen to this podcast, obviously. But yeah, it's very much the thing that we love is also the thing that we fear. And yeah, I think the book in so many ways, and the thing that we have to fear there's the old Franklin Delano Roosevelt quote: "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." With the Great Depression, I'm really getting off into things here, but it's like the only thing we have to fear is ourselves. Is often we're the ones that are the problem more often than not.
And we definitely see that in this book. One of the things, like I said, I love the movie. It's still my comfort movie, which made me very nervous going into this book because I had heard how much Stephen King absolutely hates Stanley Kubrick's. And while reading it, I completely understood. It didn't change the way I feel about the movie. I love them both as completely separate entities.
Yeah.
But the love I felt from Jack toward his family made the book so tragic, where I didn't feel like the movie was tragic.
Yeah, and I think having like obviously, I first came to the book. I saw the film first. What am I saying? And I can't help when I read the book, I can't help but hear Jack Nicholson's voice as Jack Torrance whenever he speaks.
Sure.
There's just a kind of sarcasm that was like amazing casting. Like this is the obvious person to put in this film. But yeah, it is. He's pretty in the film. He's more or less like right when they start to go to the Overlook in the film. He's like, I think he's already been turned, and it's a little more. I mean, I think just the advantage of have a 650-page novel as opposed to a 2-hour plus film, which is a lot of film, but you get to have that more slow. And admittedly, I've got a couple of Salem's Lot's over 600 pages. It's over 1,000. Like Stephen King is an author who likes to take his time and build tension, and it can be. In some ways, he's an excellent writer, moves fast, but he puts you out in the weeds for a while, and then he slowly, builds the tension and suspense. And we see this man who is, I don't know if I like him, but I just certainly sympathize with him.
Sure. I feel like he's genuinely trying.
Yeah.
But also, while we're talking on character differences, Wendy. After reading the book, I don't know how I'll ever stand to watch Wendy's portrayal, because I felt in the book that she was so strong, and like I felt everything about film Wendy was lacking now at knowing who she was in the book. That she was this very strong matriarch. She wasn't like freezing up and freaking out. But we also know that Shelley Duvall was actually truly traumatized.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much of that was Shelley Duvall actually struggling and how much of it is characters being written differently.
Yeah. And not to get back to the film, but yeah, Kubrick, particularly in his later stages of making films, was known to do 50, 60, 70, 100 takes. And Duvall was she was in a lot of Robert Altman films where it was improvisation, and he was somebody like directors that she'd work with were very actor friendly. Like, we'll make the best of it, play along, we see what happens. Whereas, I think if you're doing that many takes, do you even know what you want? It's like you're going to make people do takes until you decide, oh, that's what I want. But it also exhausts the actors, and there is a point where you do get tired.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those, I don't know what I want, but I'll know it when I see it.
And I think, too, the difference in the film and the book, you go into this kind of omniscient narrator. It kind of goes from omniscient to close into people's perspectives, that you have that time to kind of show like their inner workings and their thoughts and the ideas that are bouncing around their heads. And I think it just does so much to create sympathy for really all the characters. Absolutely. That are not wholly evil in the book. So.
It makes the ending even harder, because I know, at least for a part of me, I was really hoping, despite seeing the movie and knowing, that Jack would somehow make it out. That he would get away from the hotel and he could continue on the path to heal his family. Wherein, like I said, in the movie, I was like, oh, thank God that guy's dead.
Yeah.
Oh, that's helpful to the earth. Where in the book I was like, can he make
yeah that kind of instead of someone that is wholly in the like the Jack is wholly consumed by the place, Whereas you see that struggle, you see that, he's a much more tragic figure in that way. He wants to be better. When we hear his mind, like, I love my kids, I want to do better. But then again, he's also like extraordinarily petty at the same time, and stupid, and just does dumb things that I think are like infuriating.
Yeah, he definitely bites the hands that feed him.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again.
And I think that's a real. I mean, what I was interested, I was very like, and again, this is where you have the like separate. I think with somebody like Stephen King, it can be difficult to separate where he talks about his autobiographical context for his books, because he's very likable. He does interviews, and as we learn when we're English majors, that you shouldn't. That's not the definitive way of looking at it. There's the whole death of the author thing, and all that. But it's like the author's perspective and how they're experiencing is just one way of looking at it. But it's hard not to miss that with somebody like King, because it's so well documented. Because he's still a popular writer and he still writes and reflects on these things. And I think I remember one little thing I remember hearing or reading, that when Stephen King lived in Maine in the winter, he and his family were so poor they had to basically eat lobster 3 times a day. And
Back in the day,
when it was readily available, and that was just facts about like they used to crunch up lobsters for fertilizer in Maine and things like that, and they would feed them to prisoners, and it was almost like cruel and unusual punishment. And now we think about this thing that is like so like popular and almost like a special event kind of food, there's lots of lobsters in Maine is what it's basically saying. But he clearly reflects that economic uncertainty and poverty that he grew up with. And I think particularly in this book that you're just on the edge of things falling apart. Like, Jack doesn't keep this job. That's going to be bad for the whole family. Collapse, homelessness, being there. They are almost on the precipice of being unhoused. And it's just very, very tough situation. And having to kowtow to people in power really comes through.
Yeah, that's definitely. I think I would also act like Jack if I was put up with old Ullman when he finally loses it on the phone. Yeah. But also, I don't have a child that I'm trying to take care of.
Yeah.
I have a little more freedom in that respect. And I think that was one of the points where it's hard to feel sorry for him.
Yeah.
As sympathetic as we've talked about Jack being as a character, when he does those kinds of things, you're just like, are you kidding me? Is your pride worth it?
Mm-hmm. And it just there's a scene where he finds a scrapbook of the Overlook and all these newspapers that somebody else put together. So he's basically found someone else's research. And he just gets suddenly this idea to write this big scathing book about the Overlook Hotel and its history or whatever. And then he decides the Ullman is like the manager of the place, and he's in the opening, and the kind of very like first line is a description of like Stuart Ullman being a officious little prick.
Yeah.
Very memorable opening to this novel. And then he just wants to like rub it in his face. Like, you didn't tell me everything about the Overlook Hotel, and now I'm going to write this scathing novel, which is a good example. As I wrote, don't tell anyone about your writing project before you even really start planning things out or writing. That it is like, I think it is almost like the meta aspects of it, where it's King, examining the writing process and the artistic endeavor, and this is a book about a writer and an artist, which is something that comes up a lot in King. There's a lot of like writers in his books, and that, that's a good way to kill your ideas if you go tell too many people about it. You got to like get something on the page before you start, because people are like, it's a terrible idea or it's a great idea, and that he's just at that. He just really is just he just gets a little full of himself at that point when he just should have just shut up.
Yep, I agree. I also wonder if Ullman's characterization isn't more through Jack's lens.
Yeah.
Because we know Ullman has very good reasons for being so hesitant about who he makes the caretaker. And I can understand, especially if he knows Jack's history, any at all. And now there's a little boy. He's like, oh, no, I've seen this before.
Yeah.
So I've wondered, is Ullman really a bad guy here?
Yeah.
Or is he trying to prevent a situation again? And is it just Jack feeling caged and against the wall that he's like projecting this?
Yeah, he can't do any. He has to kind of supplicate himself to this guy who's going to give him a job, doesn't want to give him a job, but he's being, he's got people above him that's like, hey, give this guy a job. He needs the job. And I think it is a little bit like it's kind of like The Office in that we're all annoyed. Whoever the boss is, we're annoyed, and they're and it doesn't matter how competent or incompetent they are. We're just going to be they're the boss. Of course, we have lots of problems with them, and that there is just that. And I think even in the book, there are moments where you like understand why Ullman, he's there to like turn a profit. He has to make choices.
And we also see that he is really competent at his job.
Yes,
he's the
extremely.
first one who's putting the books in the green since the hotel was created.
Yeah. And he is, and I think it's clearly just the language. He's coded as a gay character.
Yep.
He's not coded. It's pretty obvious. But there's obviously a lot of homophobia that was of its time, and somebody like that would have to face that kind of thing.
I also cringed every time the N-word was used.
Mm-hmm.
Just seems so unnecessary. I already disliked over the top, unnecessary.
It's not surprising that the jet setters at a fancy hotel would be full of just overt racists, though,
Yeah.
and would also want. This is the Dick O'Halloran character who's a chef, and he's African American, and that they would just be very contemptuous of someone, and also that he is kind of the cavalry in it when things get so bad. He comes from his semi-retirement in Florida working. Like it's kind of working, he's older, he's near retirement, and he literally flies out to try to save the family. Go ahead.
I don't know why I was shocked, but that he had such a hard time in the snow. Like, thinking about it, I'm like, oh, well, if he's a snowbird and he's never there in the snow.
Mm-hmm.
But then I don't know, I was just very surprised to find that Dick Halloran was having such a hard time getting there. Especially knowing the movie, because in the movie it seems like, boom, he's there, no problem. So I like that the book drew out his journey as well. Also, quick spoiler, he survives. That always broke my heart every time I watched the movie. So knowing that, I don't know how he survived with all of the details of what happened to him. But then, we get the epilogue a year later of them all still being around each other. And I thought that was a nice little newfound family kind of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think too, and certainly, I had seen the movie first, as I mentioned. And I was just like, oh, good. Yeah, he seems like a good guy. And he's the first O'Halloran character. Just feel like it's better just to call it Dick. Dick O'Halloran. And that he's the first character that introduces us to the show that Danny is not alone in whatever his second sight is, his ability to read people's minds, to see the future, that he is part of a community, that there are other people like him, and that he has someone he could literally reach out and touch with his mind if he needed help. And talks about O'Halloran talks about his grandmother. And so that sense of an extended family that is implied there, as opposed to, I do think this is kind of this is a novel about the dangers of the nuclear family.
Absolutely.
That you were kind of out on your own, and that idea of an extended family, that sense of like you got cousins, you got all these, you got friends, neighbors who basically are family. If you're in trouble, they're there for you. And that they are in a more kind of professional situation where Jack has to get a job. He has to kowtow to the people so he can keep his job, but he loses his job. So it's just this economic, it's a very kind of unstable situation that he's in, and how that's so, not that people that are in extended families are not in like perfect loving relationships where everyone's happy, but there's so much tumult in the family when little things happen.
While we're on Halloran and his abilities. So he says everybody has a little bit of shine to him, except Jack. Do you think that this was inherently in Jack, or was that the darkness? Was this something that had grown in him to overtake his shine? Or was he inherently always going to end up on this path?
I mean, I think in some ways, like maybe it's like, it's like it's good to have a little shine in you. I think he talks about also mothers having that. They're just worried about they're worried about their kids. They're mindful. Where is my child? And we're lots of passages in the book. We don't know what Jack's doing. When you see things from Jack's perspective, he's in his own little world, and he's only thinking about what's in front of him, which is a wonderful convenience to have if you're an artist. But I think the depiction of Wendy as a mother is extraordinarily sympathetic because you see all these little thoughts running through her mind about like where, what do we got to do this? Or if we go to my mother's, what's going to happen? How do it's like trading one monster for another and I think in some ways you're talking about like, this is a commentary on art, then inevitably the artist has to be extraordinarily selfish to get the work done. They've got to have some time to themselves to do the work. But what happens when your family is there? These are ostensibly the people you love the most, and you're kind of closing yourself off from them to do your art. So it's and it is also, this is also from an author who is an extraordinarily prolific author, So it is this kind of interesting mixed message about art and the people who are involved and are family of the artist, or people with friends, or close relations.
I feel like it could also be a cautionary tale of yes, your art's important and it's okay to get lost in them, but there needs to be a time.
Yeah, and I feel like this is again, not to read too much and not to do kind of a psychological reading of King, but it kind of it seems to come out of his own anxieties about that. That the best way to deal with it is just to, and again, this is where I feel like nowadays with the kids nowadays, it's like, this artist could have just went to therapy. Yes, therapy's good, but oftentimes we use art to work through our frustrations and our anxieties and our fears. We wouldn't have a lot of art if we didn't do that. And so I think it's him kind of like, and particularly as he was becoming a more and more popular author, this was the book that really it was the third novel after Carrie, and then Salem's Lot, which did very well, but this one was like the big honking bestseller. That's like, he's Stephen King now. And then things like all these other amazing, successful books came afterwards. And I'm rambling here, so I apologize. Okay. So I think it is that tension that he has with his own creating and his own like frustration at himself for being this way, and that this is like the dark version. Like, I feel like what if Stephen King wrote a book like, what if I wasn't quite as successful, and he's grateful for being successful, what if I wasn't as successful and bad things happened to me? What would my life be like? That is that kind of speculation of that.
His deepest fears. That's why it's so scary.
Yeah, and I think too, it's a way where he's using genre fiction to kind of talk about, examining the artist through a genre work, where if it was like he's a serious artist or something, it would be really, really pretentious. He's like a guy that's like working on a play about a prep school. It's very like, wherever he's at, he wants to write about it. So it is clearly like an example of write what you know kind of thing. And it's a little on the nose. And I'm really glad we hear him talk about his plots and how his sympathies toward his characters change, the stories, but we don't see any word that he's written. And that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Because I think he would really annoy me. I would not have sympathy for him if he was a terrible writer, or just like an ersatz kind of mediocre writer.
I've recently read a book, The Writing Retreat by Julia Bardo. And I bring this up because in that book, it hinges on the idea of you have one great work in you. And I wondered if that's what Jack was falling into. he was a writer, a great writer that one time, and now his spark is gone. And so I was wondering if maybe that was what he used his shine up on.
Yeah.
Can it be used up?
Yeah, it was like it was a story that got published in Esquire,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah, and I think too he's someone that gets very distracted because he's stuck adapting a story into a play, and then he's working on the play, and then he gets the idea for the Overlook Hotel, and he's just like at the same time he's like always looking at the 5 projects ahead kind of thing.
I'm the same kind of writer.
I
I'm
mean,
not gonna lie.
I think it is. You know, I'll admit this. Just as a teacher, you know, I'll be like, I have got this class I'm teaching this summer. I'm looking forward to it, but I'm always like, but wait a minute, what about next spring when I get a chance to teach this type of class? I'm already, you know, like plan that class that's coming up, and make that one good, and then do the other one that you're thinking about down the road. And there is that. You know, these are novels, so there is the novelty of newness that plays up in it, and I think that's something that he's kind of, as a writer, it's something like just hunker down. If you're gonna do anything, you got to hunker down and live in it. Even though living in it is going, like, however long it takes, it's going to fundamentally change you. This is just off, but it's unrelated but related. When I was in grad school, there was one of the fellow grad students, Dave Madden. He did a book about taxidermy, and it took him several years to write the book. At the end of it, you know, he was kind of like, he wrote an essay in a workshop, and his workshop, writing workshop, he said, "Hey, this is really good. You should expand this." And then it eventually became a book, and I signed it. I taught it in a comp class when it came out. I really enjoyed it, and I suddenly cannot remember the name of it all of a sudden. I have several copies. But you know, there was the initial, I wrote an essay for this, and then I ended up writing like a 200-page book for this. And so your whole perspective about something changes.
Absolutely.
Usually when people write about, like, I think I'm done with this book. I think I'm done with this book and I'm ready to go on to something else. But Jack's character seems to be something like the newness of something, the newness of the Overlook. There's hope, springs eternal, but then things sour very quickly. Like, it seemed like once they were teaching, he's in a relationship, it's exciting, but things kind of settle in. So you have to be wary of those people that love novelty sometimes. They need to grow up and train themselves. Not like, okay, it's not, everything doesn't have to be sparkling new every time. But yeah, to me, he feels a lot like that kind of character.
With that being said, I'm shocked that like an affair never came up for him.
It didn't seem to. Yeah, I think his affair was with alcohol.
Absolutely.
And it was, and I think one of the things that this is a really compelling book representing the struggles with alcohol in particular. Yeah. So much of, you know, socially, you know, people who drink or don't drink, you know, that so much of it, you know, we have businesses that are solely dedicated to the dispensary of beverages one at a time, or in, you know, bottles, or 6 or 12 or 24 or kegs. You know, these are whole businesses that are regulated by states. You know, you literally have bars. You know, most cities have some sort of bar of some sort, and there's a whole, like, we'll see you at the bar, and how much of your life is dictated by that, and what happens when that becomes the focus in your life. In a sense.
Place where everybody knows your name.
Yeah, a place where everybody knows you. They're happy to have you. They'll miss you when you're gone. And how, if you try to extricate yourself from that, how absent your life is if you don't have these kind of, like, here's the bar, this is where everyone goes to socially drink. You know, and for a lot of people, they can handle just a few and it's fine. But for other people, when it's one person I knew that it basically became like a second job to him.
Yeah.
And then other people can be much more destructive. Like, they can manage it, but it's like, this is just taking up too much of my life. Or it can be extremely destructive, as in the case of Jack. Yeah. So,
and we get from Jack, he knows if he has one that he's done.
Yeah.
But then there is also a relief in that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, at least in Jack, he could fight. He fought harder because he knew the second he lost that battle, it was a lost.
Yeah.
And seeing that struggle was really interesting.
Yeah. You have like things like the motif of like him having his handkerchief and wiping it across. It is just like, oh, that's what he usually did when he was drinking. When he was on when he was doing the bad thing. And that he at some point he's basically like that version of himself without the alcohol. He's doing all the things. There's a detail of like chewing Excedrin. Which it is, I can understand how that would be kind of a bad habit one could get into.
I will also say, going back to Wendy's character, it was very heartwarming to see how quickly heartwarming and kind of frustrating that she was like, no, the hotel's doing it. There's no alcohol here. And I wondered if that was like an enabler. Because yes, even if the hotel magically stocked itself with alcohol, Jack still made the decision to drink.
Yeah.
He did it. So, like, while I thought it was really sweet that she was trying to see the man that she loved there, at the same time, he did do the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
and yeah, I was kind of interested in is he's a character who is between like, I'm a victim. And he's in between, like, always wanting to play the victim. Like, everyone's against me. That's why the wasp stung me. That's why I'm doing this job, because everyone hates me and everyone's against me. To, like, actually accepting responsibility for his actions. And, like, he wants to do better. But he just, it is just this tug. I think he's a really interesting character. And a lot of the other, I'd read the other two, Stephen King's first two books, Carrie and Salem's Lot. And he liked to put a lot of characters in and kind of do a little, like tell a little bit. He would certainly go in depth with his characters. You got to sense you knew them. But with The Shining, he kind of pared everything down, almost stage-like. Is the play that's where there's basically a 3-character play and then a hologram. A few people pop up on the periphery. But it's just 3 people in a hotel. And you really get to dig into their fears and their trepidations and all of the things that make them not appealing and endearing. And he just really gets, it's a little like, I know a little too much about this guy.
Yeah, for sure. I will say, though, the most horrifying part of this whole novel for me was the dog man. That is the only part of this whole book that I'm so glad was not in the movie. But I did think of King of the Hill. I don't know if you've ever seen the episode of King of the Hill where Bobby takes clowning classes and becomes Tartuffe the Wonder Dog. But that's what I thought of every time they would talk about the dog man. And now with you talking about having to kowtow, I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's what it was, like the extreme symbolism for, is Jack seeing himself as the dog.
Yeah. Well, there's this, I can't memorize. I'm not very good at remembering. There's this Alexander Pope little 2-line poem, and it's 2 lines and one of the title. If I'm getting this incorrect, please, 18th century scholars, please correct us. I am His Royal Highness's dog at Kew. Who, kind sir, whose dog are you? And it was a poem where it's like on his little ID thing or whatever. That's what this poem says.
Funny.
So hilarious. But yeah, I mean, it is like everyone is like control. Everybody, there is I guess it's kind of like the kind of literary naturalism that we're all, like how much autonomy do we have? We're being controlled by something.
Yeah.
And so literally and figuratively, Jack is being controlled by his demons. These like supernatural ghostly demons of this hotel, and then his own addictions, his own pride, his own vanity, his own, and how much his family suffers. And not only so, but tries to how they deal with it and fight it in so many ways. And yeah, getting back to when I just have enormous sympathy for that character. She's tough. She's not a superhero. She figures things out. She cares. And just, it is, I think and sometimes it's also like the fear of like, this is what happens when you get married. There's this very difficult, unpredictable person that you have to live with. you know, yeah, and it's very much, I think, something I wrote in my notes. It's a book that's very much in that kind of Gothic tradition. So you have the Gothic tradition coming out with the kind of Age of Reason as something of a response to that. This kind of way to like be rational and scientific, but then there's folklore and mysticism and scary stuff and ghosts. So it's like I was really fascinated when you had Danny and his shining, like trying to be logically explained in a way that kind of makes sense as the reader, but also the way in which it kind of like there is this other kind of magical supernatural aspect to it all.
I think when I was doing my research, people were talking about maybe it's Dr. Sleep. It gives you more info too. That Tony is Danny from the future because Danny's middle name is Anthony. And that's how he knows what's going to happen is that Tony that's why he's always so far away.
So it's a time travel. It's actually a time travel story.
Yeah, and that's his shine is that that's why he sees the future because he's lived it. But I don't know how much truth is in that. That was just one of the things that I was reading in discussions.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, this is a kind of book that lends itself to a lot of intriguing and varied readings of it. I certainly feel that way. I was also, one of the things I was thinking about, what were your kind of thoughts about Danny as a character, as a child? And
I think King did a good job getting the curiosity, but definitely more mature than what I would assume. But then I'm like, is that because he was abused? This home that he grew up in, he had to be more grown up than everybody else. Or was it Tony? Was it the shine making him a little more?
At one point, Jack does say we don't talk down to him when he tells Allman about it. He seems like a very proper young gentleman. He's like, we don't talk down to him. That they treat him like an adult in a lot of ways. So maybe that ages him up. I always feel this way. Is just haunted by writing workshops where someone writes about a kid and somebody says it every time. Like, that kid doesn't sound like he's 12. Or that kid. Nobody's like, that guy doesn't sound like he's 48. It just doesn't. I don't believe it. So it's always, I mean, I do think it is that kind of like, what do we expect children? What is the emotional and intellectual capacity that we expect out of children? And why do we often question it in fiction? I mean, it is fiction, right? But I do think this book in particular shows how emotionally complex and complicated children are.
Sure.
And that he is, not to get too Freudian about it, but he's got two parents and he's basically the tension between them. He feels it all. Like, he's an empath more than a mind reader. He knows how they feel about things. He knows, their complex emotion that's feeding into him. So I think, it is, maybe, and I'm not one of these people that are like, oh, we're smart and then we get really stupid as we get older. But there is this kind of like, there's this awareness that he has. And I think that King as a writer and then the story really respects that Danny notices these things if he can't quite articulate them, because there's also the thing about, well, he can't say words that the words that he doesn't know to say are the words that he's learned. So it is like you can see the ideas behind whatever limited vocabulary he has. I mean, he's a kid that is just learning to read.
Yeah. Listen, I definitely agree. I've seen several times, especially on the internet, people be like, kids don't act like that.
Yeah.
But I think that this is one book where that didn't occur to me because of the supernatural element. He had something in his mind. So to me, I was just like, yeah, even if he's like a grown-up kid, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's kind of like, well, there could be I always think there's a kid that acts like that somewhere, but I don't necessarily espouse some sort of realistic, like a kid has to be realistic.
Yeah.
In any way. Like, that's, all kids are going to be a little different. I do think, and this is really important, that reading people's minds is not a cool superpower to have, and this one sucks. And this is a good example of a story that shows that. It's like it's a lot of pressure to have.
You
on
really don't want to
somebody.
know what everybody around you
Yeah.
is.
You know that. Yeah, it is like what women want, but the dark super horror version of it. You don't want to know because you get the muddle of things, and that's the real horror of the book. I think.
Agreed. Do you have any other thoughts or anything else you'd like to talk about?
I think one thing I guess I was interested in was these are long books, and it takes a lot of time to read. Stephen King has shorter books, but it takes a long time to get through that book. So I'm thinking kind of like how. Did you feel like it was like? Did it take for you as a reader? Did it take you a little while to get going? Did you kind of warm up to it, or did you have a point where you're like, I'm in the zone?
I listened to it on audiobook.
Yes, but
and that was really helpful, because let me say, I've said I love this one. I've tried for years to read it all the way through, so this was my first successful attempt all the way through it. And there definitely was. I listened to it over break. And there was definitely a point where I put it down for like 2 or 3 days because my brain just could not. Not that it was bad. I don't know. I got to that point with it where I was like, okay, I'm little Jack. I need a little something new to break up some of this.
Something to a kind of palate cleanser of some kind halfway through the book or something.
Yeah. Trying to identify about when that point was. That's probably about 3/4 through. I was like, okay, before I finish this. And I actually laughed and I told my partners, I was like, oh, so it turns out I still didn't finish The Shining in 2024. I finished it in 2025 because I took those days of break.
I think one is that there's very little summary in the writing. There is a lot of like, as I was told in work, Write the Island. So like basically there's the summary and scene and mixing of that, and there's a lot of like you're in the moment. There's a fair amount you're with these characters the whole time, and how oppressive that becomes after a while. As slowly their chances to get away from the hotel reduce, and then it gets snowed in, and it just is this suffocating thing that comes.
See, I normally like that. I think for me, seeing the movie first is what made it. I wasn't driven to finish it, if that makes sense. I think it would have been different if I hadn't seen the movies or the adaptations. I do struggle to read books after I've seen the adaptation to them. Yeah. I'm like, oh, well, I kind of already know. Even if I don't know fully.
I mean, I think there's a lot of, there's there's the things that a novel can do, and there are the things that a film can do, and those are profoundly different. Absolutely. So I always try my best to take it on its own terms.
I like the book, and I like Stanley Kubrick's film, and they can exist separately.
Yeah, and it was usually I can understand like how this would be an extremely personal book to its author, and then somebody else who's a bit more of a excuse me there. A bit more of a cold kind of objective view of it and the changes. I could see why. I could see why it upsets Stephen King. I could see why you could think both works in their own mediums are accomplished and well done. But yeah, I understand it all.
Yeah, and that was something, like I said, I was relieved in. By the time I had read a quarter of the book, I was already taking out my AirPods and going like, I understand why Stephen King hates Stanley Kubrick's telling, and I understand why he hated Jack Nicholson's portrayal. I understand completely reading this work.
Yeah, and I think too that's a lot of ways like toward the 90s he did a lot of the teleplays for like miniseries, and he did when they did the miniseries version, he wrote the screenplay for that. So I mean. And, it's an artist. They want control. I mean, yeah.
I did also like the miniseries. It's just a lot easier to watch a 2.5-hour film versus a 6-hour. But yeah, this is kind of my thing. I will read about any story about people snowed in somewhere or rained in, flooded in, whatever it may be, natural disaster, if something scary is going on.
Well-
It could be a murder, it could be zombies, whatever it is, I will read it.
Yeah. I mean, it's got that, like it's kind of the dream, right? You're with your cozy, you got your drinks, you got your books, you got your media, whatever you got, pets, and it's also a nightmare.
We've been talking a lot about film this one, but since the beginning, I've been thinking about Toby Hooper and his belief that the true horror starts with the family.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we see played out again and again, especially in snowy stories.
Mm-hmm.
Very rarely in these kind of stories are you with strangers.
Yeah. The family is the one that's going to kill you as opposed to the stranger. It's not going to kill. Yeah. You're more likely to get killed by one than the other. So.
You're more likely to kill yourself or someone in the home when you own a gun than you are a home intruder.
Yeah. So. It's and there's a lot of improvised weapons and mallets and knives and things like that in this one. Not a lot of gunplay. No gunplay.
I do wish the movie had more of the ghosts. I loved like them laying in bed and being able to hear the ghosts partying.
Mm-hmm.
I wish Stanley Kubrick would have gotten more of that. I think it would have helped show it as a haunted house more than a cabin fevered crazy man.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I generally think that a lot of films have to kind of ground things in some way where this, a lot of like that haunted house quality and, is it real? Isn't it real? And then you're like, oh, I don't know. Are they hallucinating? Like, no, they're not. That it has that kind of plausible deniability. So as you're reading it, is it them? Is it? And I think it kind of, I can understand why any film ever want to make this. Let's try to ground this stuff as much as possible.
Sure.
However fantastical it is, where this is a much more kind of spooky kind of atmosphere and slow build.
Yeah.
And boy, it's like hundreds of pages of it, and I dig it. So, any other final thoughts? I think this is a wonderful. I would say I had read. Was this your first Stephen King book?
It was.
I had read this, and I'd read. What was the one? The one with the thing, the one in the fog. What's the one where the monster?
The Mist.
I read The Mist. That was the first one I'd ever read, and I quite enjoyed that. Then I read Carrie, and then I read Sam's Lot, and then I read. So I was like, I'm gonna get a decent dose of Stephen King. I think Carrie is probably a good book to start if you're gonna start. It's a little shorter. It's kind of told in this kind of postmodern way where it's like news reports and. It's all kind of
epistolary.
It's got an epistolary like Dracula and things like Frankenstein. So it's got this epistolary aspect. It's like court reports, interviews, and some like things that are clearly from individual characters' perspectives. And it's a little more fractured in that way, but like also like extraordinarily appealing because he's clearly writing for a mass audience. And Salem's Lot is a big kind of, it's about a community gets turned into vampires basically, and the people that fight against it. So it's got this kind of, we're putting a team together to stop the vampires. And I generally think Carrie would probably, if anybody's going to start, I would say start with Carrie, even though I have not read all of Stephen King's books, but why not start chronologically? I haven't read many of his short stories, but yeah, something a little shorter to get started with. But I know a lot of people, it seems to be consensus, like The Shining, The Stand, those are like his best books, or people think of them as.
Honestly, I think if I'm going to read another one, it'll probably be Rose Red.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, because I love the TV movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he's got a lot to pick from, and it's Stephen King, but he's got a lot to offer. So I don't think, look around. I would highly recommend The Shining. Probably maybe not the first Stephen King book. You should don't go out of the gate. Let's save that one just for a little bit later, I would say. So
I agree. I think our next book is The Good House by Tananarive. That's our next one.
No, it's not.
Oh, is it not?
It's The Silent Land, because we were going to do Silent Land by Graham Joyce. So
and then it's The Good House.
Yeah,
okay.
Good House. So, I apologize. Yeah. So we'll do a little more next time around. We'll do a little more icebound supernatural horror stuff, and then hopefully as spring turns, we'll get to some other dark stuff. So
I'm happy for it to stay icy and snowy.
yes, that's good. It keeps the wasp from coming back so strong. So
It's magical.
yes, I even if it's cold, I'm like, yeah, more. You appreciate the spring more if you endure a long winter. So
Spring's my least favorite.
summer, it's just everything's hot. So
All right.
all righty, hang in
See
there.
you next time.
Take care. Enjoy your reading out there.